She walked into the garage in heels that had no business being there, and the man behind the counter didn't even look up from the engine he was working on. That was the first thing that surprised her. Not his face, not his hands, not the way he wiped the grease off before offering her a stool. The first thing was how he treated her like she was just another person who needed help, and she hadn't felt that in longer than she could remember. And what happened next changed everything she thought she knew about what mattered. The town was called Millbrook, though most people just called it the Crossroads, because that was really all it was. One traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 o'clock, a diner with a hand-painted pie sign out front, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and a gas station that still had a mechanic who'd look you in the eye and tell you the truth. That mechanic was Jack. He'd been running the garage for 12 years now, ever since his uncle passed it down and moved to Arizona for the dry heat. The building was weathered, the bay doors stuck a little in the humidity, and the radio on the shelf only picked up 2 stations, but the work was honest, and that was enough for him. His mornings started before the sun, coffee in a dented thermos, country music low on the speakers, and the quiet rhythm of tools against metal. He'd change oil, replace brake pads, rebuild transmissions for farmers who paid in vegetables sometimes, and he never once complained about it. People in town trusted him because he didn't pad the bill or find problems that weren't there. He fixed what was broken, charged what was fair, and if someone was in a bind, he stayed late without being asked. The house he lived in was the one he grew up in, a small wooden place set back from the road with a porch that faced the fields. His mother had kept it full of small warmth when she was alive. Fresh bread on Sundays, the smell of lavender soap in the bathroom, a radio playing in the kitchen while she cooked. She'd been gone 3 years now, and Jack hadn't changed the soap because he couldn't bring himself to. The lavender still sat on the edge of the sink, and every time he washed his hands he caught the faintest trace of her, and that was enough. He wasn't lonely, not in the way people mean when they say it with pity. The phone didn't light up much after 9, and the evenings were quiet, but he'd made peace with that kind of stillness. He'd had a couple of chances over the years, women in town who looked at him like maybe he'd be worth their time, but nothing had ever stuck. Not because he was closed off, but because nobody had walked into his life and made the quiet feel like something he wanted to share instead of something he just tolerated. And at 42, he'd more or less stopped expecting that to change. But the quiet life has a way of hiding what's missing until something walks in and fills it. Then you can't unsee the gap that was always there. The road into Millbrook was a 2-lane stretch that wound through hayfields and past old dairy barns, the kind of road where you could drive 20 minutes without seeing another car. Layla was doing 70 in a low-slung convertible that had no business on a road like this, and she knew it, but she was late, and being late wasn't something her world tolerated well. She was on her way to her family's estate, a weekend gathering her father insisted on every quarter, where the right people said the right things and the wrong people simply weren't invited. The engine gave a shudder, first a hesitation she felt in her chest before she understood it in the car. Then the dash lit up like a warning she couldn't read, and the steering went heavy, and the car rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder, with a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a sigh. She sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, dressed for a dinner that started 2 hours ago. Silk blouse, structured jacket, heels that cost more than most people's rent. The kind of outfit that made sense at a country club, and made no sense at all standing on the side of a farm road. Her phone had 1 bar, then none, then 1 again, enough to see 3 missed calls from her father's assistant, and not enough to call back. She stepped out of the car onto gravel in those heels, and the sound they made was almost funny. A sharp click against loose stone, like she was walking onto a stage that nobody had prepared for her. The air smelled like cut grass and diesel, and the only sound was wind moving through the trees and the tick of an engine cooling down. She looked down the road in both directions, and there was nothing but fields and fence lines, and a sky that was bigger than any sky she'd ever seen in the city. And for a moment, just a moment, the emptiness of it felt like relief, like the world had stopped making demands of her and was just letting her stand there and breathe. That was when she noticed the sign, hand-painted on a piece of plywood, leaning against a fence post. Jack's Auto, half-mile, an arrow pointed left. She stared at it for a long time because in her world you didn't walk half a mile anywhere, and you certainly didn't walk it toward a place with a plywood sign. But the car was dead, the phone was useless, and the dinner was already lost. So she started walking, heels clicking on gravel, silk jacket catching the evening wind, walking toward something she couldn't have planned for if she'd tried. The garage was a single bay building with a concrete floor stained black from years of oil changes and a metal desk cluttered with receipts and loose bolts. A radio was playing something slow and acoustic, and the smell was gasoline and old rubber and coffee that had been sitting on a hot plate since morning. Layla stood in the open bay door and watched a man's legs sticking out from under a sedan, and she cleared her throat, and nothing happened. She cleared it again, and the man rolled himself out on a creeper, looked up at her from the floor, and she watched his eyes do exactly what every man's eyes did when they saw her for the first time. Except they didn't. He looked at her face for about 1 second, then his gaze dropped to her shoes, then to the road behind her, and he said, "Car trouble," like he was asking what kind of sandwich she wanted. And just like that, the thing she'd been bracing for, since she was old enough to understand how men looked at her, didn't happen. The absence of it was so strange that she forgot to answer for a moment. There was no stare and no flattery, no posture shift, no voice change, none of the little calculations she'd learned to read in men since she was 16 years old. He just saw a person with a problem, and his mind went straight to the problem. She told him what happened, the shudder, the dash, the dying, and he nodded and reached for a rag on the bench without taking his eyes off the description she was giving. "Sounds like your alternator," he said, and he said it the way you'd say, "Sounds like rain." Just a fact, not a sales pitch. He grabbed a flashlight and walked past her toward the road, and she followed, and when he got to her car he popped the hood and leaned in, without commenting on the make or the leather seats or the fact that this was the most expensive car he'd probably ever touched. She stood next to him, arms crossed, waiting for the look, the question, the angle. It never came. He poked around under the hood for 3 minutes, then straightened up and said, "Yup. Alternator's shot. I can order the part, but it won't be here until tomorrow afternoon." He said it plainly, the way you'd tell someone the weather, and then he gestured back toward the garage. "I've got coffee inside if you want to sit while I make some calls." There was no price tag on the offer, and no expectation behind it, just a man extending a small, ordinary courtesy, like it cost him nothing, because to him it didn't. Layla sat on a stool next to the metal desk, a paper cup of coffee in both hands, and she watched Jack dial the parts supplier on a phone that had a cord and a rotary dial. The garage felt like a place out of time, a space that existed before the world she lived in was built, and sitting in it was like stepping into a different decade. He spoke briefly, confirmed the part, hung up, and turned to her. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" The question landed differently than it would have from anyone else. From a man at a bar, it would have been a line. From a business acquaintance, it would have been networking. From Jack, it was just logistics, the same way he'd ask a farmer whether his truck could wait until Monday. She hesitated, and the hesitation surprised her because she wasn't used to needing anyone for anything. Her phone buzzed in her bag and she pulled it out to find a single bar of signal. And she dialed quickly and spoke in a low, careful voice that Jack couldn't help but hear. "I'm fine. I'll explain later. Don't send anyone." She hung up before the person on the other end could respond. Jack didn't ask about the call, didn't raise an eyebrow or file it away for later, and instead just said, "There's a motel in town. Millie, who runs it, is at her sister's this week, so that's out." A pause. Then, simply, "I've got a spare room. Clean bed. Quiet house. No strings." He said it like he was offering someone an umbrella in the rain, the kind of thing you do, because it's what you do, not because you expect something back. Layla looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her that she couldn't name. In her world, every offer came with fine print. Every kindness was a transaction. Every gesture a setup for a request that would come later. This man was offering her a place to sleep because she needed one, and the only thing he wanted in return was for her to be safe. And she didn't know what to do with that. She said yes, and the word felt strange in her mouth, like she'd forgotten how to accept help without calculating the cost. What she couldn't have known yet was that this small yes, this tiny surrender to trust, was only the first of many things this town and this man would undo in her. They walked into town because the garage truck only had 2 seats and the bench was full of parts catalogs, and Layla's heels were not made for gravel roads. So she kicked them off and carried them barefoot on the warm pavement, and Jack didn't say a word about it. The diner was called Dots, a single room with formica counters, red vinyl stools bolted to the floor, and a pie case that held exactly 4 pies and a plate of cornbread. A woman behind the counter with gray hair and a name tag that read Dot looked up when they came through the door, and her eyes went straight to Layla, and then to Jack, and then back to Layla. And the arithmetic was plain on her face. Jack slid into a corner booth without ceremony and said, "Meatloaf's good," and Layla sat across from him and realized that nobody in this town cared about her last name, because nobody in this town knew it. Dot came over with 2 glasses of water and said, "Who's your friend, Jack?" And he said, "Car trouble." And that was the whole introduction. No elaborate backstory, no storytelling, no making Layla into a spectacle for the diner to consume. He protected her privacy without being asked, without even seeming to think about it, and she felt the weight of that more than she'd felt the weight of most compliments she'd received in her life. The meatloaf arrived, and it was exactly what meatloaf is supposed to be, warm and heavy and unpretentious, and she ate it like a regular person eating a regular dinner, and Jack told her about the 1952 Ford truck he was restoring in the back of the garage. He talked about the engine like it was a patient he was nursing back to health, with patience and respect and a kind of tenderness she'd never heard a man apply to anything that wasn't a person. And she laughed, not the controlled laugh she used at dinner parties, the one calibrated to be charming without being too loud, but a real laugh, the kind that comes out before you can stop it. And it startled her so much she covered her mouth with her napkin, like she'd said something wrong. Jack didn't flinch. He just smiled, a small, quiet smile that didn't ask for anything, and kept talking about the truck, and she sat there in a vinyl booth in a town she'd never heard of, eating meatloaf with a man she'd met 2 hours ago, and she felt more like herself than she had in years. The feeling was so unfamiliar that it took her a moment to recognize it. It was comfort, real comfort, the kind that doesn't come from thread counts or room service, but from being somewhere you don't have to perform. And the dangerous thing about comfort like that, the thing nobody warns you about, is that once you've felt it, going back to the performance feels like putting on a costume that no longer fits. Jack's house was small and wooden and set back from the road, with a porch that had 2 rocking chairs and a view of nothing but fields and a sky that went on forever. He showed her the spare room, a clean space with a quilt on the bed, and a window that looked out over the backyard, and he said, "Bathroom's down the hall, towels are in the cabinet," and then he left her alone, because he understood that some people need a moment to land in an unfamiliar place before they can be expected to talk. Layla couldn't sleep, because the house was too quiet, or maybe it was the right kind of quiet, and her mind didn't know what to do without the noise she was used to. She pulled on a sweater she'd found in her bag and stepped out onto the porch. And Jack was already there, sitting in one of the rockers, staring up at the stars like he did this every night, which he probably did. He looked up when the screen door creaked, said, "Can't sleep either?" And she shook her head and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. When she finally spoke, it came out in a way she hadn't planned. She told them she was tired of being a possession. That people didn't see her when they looked at her, they saw what she represented. The name, the connections, the access she could provide. Every man she'd ever dated treated her like a door he wanted to walk through, not a person he wanted to know. She'd been on dates where the man spent the whole evening talking about what he wanted to build, what he wanted to become, and she was just the accessory that made his story sound better. She said all of it without looking at Jack, looking at the stars instead, because it was easier to tell the truth to the sky than to a person sitting 2 feet away. Jack listened the way he listened to an engine, patient and attentive, not trying to fix anything, just understanding what was wrong, and when she was done, he didn't offer advice or try to spin it into something hopeful. He just nodded, and then he told her about his mother, about how the house still smelled like her lavender soap, and how he couldn't bring himself to buy a different kind even though it had been 3 years. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and the simplicity of it was more intimate than anything she'd heard in any of the confessionals she'd sat through in therapy, or late-night conversations with friends who wanted to fix her more than know her. They sat there for another hour, maybe longer, talking about the things that keep people up at night, and somewhere in that conversation, without either of them naming it, a door opened that neither of them had expected. Not a romantic door, not yet. Just the door of being known, which is rarer and more dangerous than any other kind of closeness, and harder to close once it's open. And what neither of them could have known, sitting there in the dark, was that the morning would test everything they'd found in the night. Layla woke to the sound of tools, and when she went to the window she saw Jack under the hood of her car, already working, the morning light catching the edges of his shoulders as he leaned into the engine. He'd started early so she wouldn't be delayed, and the thoughtfulness of it was so unannounced, so without fanfare, that it took her a moment to even recognize it as thoughtfulness. By the time she came outside, the car was running, the hood was closed, and Jack was wiping his hands on a shop rag, looking at her like he had nothing left to prove and nothing left to ask. She reached into her bag for her wallet, and he shook his head once, a single, easy motion. "You needed help," he said. "That's not something you charge extra for." She stood there with her wallet half open, and something broke open in her chest. Not dramatically, not like a dam, more like a crack in a wall she didn't know she'd been building. In her world, everything had a price, and everyone wanted something, and kindness was just a slower form of negotiation. This man wanted nothing, and the wanting of nothing was the most disarming thing she'd ever encountered. She didn't have a grand speech, and she didn't try to make one. She found a napkin on the passenger seat of her car, wrote her number on it, and walked back to the porch and set it on the railing, leaning against one of the rocking chairs, like it was a note anyone might leave. She didn't know if he'd call, and she wasn't sure she wanted him to, because wanting things from people had never worked out the way she hoped. But she knew, as she pulled out of the gravel lot and onto the 2-lane road, that she was leaving something behind, and that the something was more than just her phone number. What she couldn't have known was how hard it would be to live without it, once she returned to a life where everything had a price except the one thing she actually wanted. 2 weeks later, Layla was standing in a ballroom on the top floor of a hotel downtown, wearing a dress that cost more than Jack made in a month, holding a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking, and feeling emptier than she had felt standing on that gravel road in Millbrook. The room was full of people who spoke in careful sentences that meant different things than the words they used, and every face was a calculation, and every handshake was a transaction, and she moved through it the way she always did, smiling the right amount, saying the right things, being the person her father needed her to be in rooms like this one. Her father appeared at her elbow, tall and silver-haired and effortless in his tuxedo, and he mentioned a man named Richard, the son of a family they'd done business with for 2 decades. "He's asked about you 3 times tonight," her father said. And the way he said was not a suggestion, but a direction, the kind of statement that carried the weight of expectation without ever making the demand explicit. Richard was polished and connected, and exactly the kind of arrangement she was supposed to want, and she'd met him before, and he was perfectly fine, and perfectly fine was starting to feel like a prison sentence. She stepped out onto the terrace to breathe, and the city lights stretched out below her like a grid of obligations, and she thought about a porch with 2 rocking chairs and a sky full of stars, and a man who handed her coffee without wanting a single thing except for her to be warm. Her phone buzzed in her clutch, not Jack's number. She didn't think he'd called. But the thought of that napkin on the railing, and whether he'd kept it, whether it was still there, or whether the wind had carried it off, like it was never meant to stay, sat in her mind like a question she couldn't answer. She went back inside, and she smiled at Richard when he approached, and she said the right things, and she hated every second of it, because now she knew what genuine felt like, and this was not it. Genuine was a garage that smelled like gasoline and old coffee. Genuine was a man who didn't change his voice when he talked to her. Genuine was Meatloaf in a vinyl booth, and a laugh that came out before she could stop it. And standing in that ballroom, surrounded by everything she was supposed to want, she realized that the things she actually wanted wouldn't be found in any room her father could build or buy. And that realization, once it landed, didn't go away. It sat in her chest like a stone, and it got heavier every day. Her father noticed the change, because her father noticed everything that might affect the arrangements he'd spent decades constructing. He didn't ask her what was wrong, because in their family, people didn't ask, they investigated. He sent his driver, a man named Clark, who had worked for the family for 15 years, and who understood that his job was not transportation, but observation. Clark found Layla in her apartment, sitting at the kitchen counter in jeans and an old sweater, scrolling through photos of restored trucks on her phone. And when he reported back, he said only, "She's been different since she got back, sir." Different was not acceptable in a world where different meant variables, and variables meant risk, and risk was the one thing her father's circle did not tolerate. The solution, as it always was in that world, was to accelerate the arrangement, and a dinner was scheduled at the family estate rather than the hotel, an intimate setting that would make the introduction feel personal rather than strategic, with Richard as the guest of honor, and the unspoken expectation that Layla would give him a real chance. 300 miles away, Jack found the napkin in his shirt pocket. Didn't remember putting it there. Must have slipped it in without thinking, the way you pocket a receipt you don't need. Unfolding it, he looked at the number written in neat, careful handwriting, and he stared at it for a long time, standing in his kitchen with the lavender soap on the sink and the quiet house all around him. What he wanted was to call, but what would he say? A mechanic in a town with one traffic light talking to someone whose life he couldn't even imagine. He didn't know her last name, or what she did, or where she came from. All he knew was that it was a place so far from Millbrook that the distance wasn't measured in miles, but in the kind of life you lived. He folded the napkin back up and set it on the kitchen windowsill, next to a jar of nails and a dead fly that had been there since spring, and he told himself it was better this way, that some doors aren't meant to be opened from his side of the tracks. But he left the napkin on the windowsill, and he didn't throw it away, and that small act of keeping was braver than he knew. Because keeping something instead of letting it go means you haven't given up yet, even when you've told yourself you have. Layla drove back to Millbrook on a Thursday, not because she'd planned to, but because the city had started to feel like a place where she was stored rather than a place where she lived. She didn't call ahead, didn't check if the garage was open, didn't think past the impulse of getting in the car and driving, until the buildings thinned out and the fields began. 3 hours later she was turning onto the road with a plywood sign, and the garage appeared just like she remembered it. Bay door open, radio playing, a pair of boots sticking out from under a truck. Jack heard the heels before he saw her, and he rolled out from under the truck, and the look on his face was something between surprise and a feeling he wouldn't let himself name. She was standing there in jeans this time, and a simple blouse, not the designer clothes from before. And her hair was down, and she looked more like herself than she had in the silk and the heels, and he noticed that immediately and said nothing about it. She said, "I needed to see something that was real," and the words were so simple and so heavy that Jack didn't have a response. So he did what he always did when he didn't know what to say. He took her to the diner. Dot didn't even blink this time, just set 2 cups of coffee on the table and walked away. And Layla wrapped her hands around the cup and felt the familiar comfort of this small, warm place where nothing cost more than what the menu said. But something was different this time. Jack was gentle and kind, same as before, but there was a distance in him now, a carefulness, like he'd made a decision in the 2 weeks since she'd left and he was sticking to it. He talked about the truck, about the weather, about a part he was waiting for, and all of it was pleasant, and none of it was the conversation they'd had on the porch. Layla felt him pulling away even as she was pulling closer, and the frustration of being truly seen by someone who then decides he's not enough for you is a particular kind of pain, sharp and quiet at the same time. She wanted to say something, to push through the careful wall he'd built, but she didn't know how, because in her world, pushing was negotiating, and she'd promised herself she'd never negotiate with someone who mattered. So she stayed for dinner, and they laughed some, and the evening was warm in all the ways it had been before, but there was a door between them now that hadn't been there on the porch that first night, and she couldn't find the handle. And a door you can't find has a way of forcing a choice. You either stop looking, or you start searching harder. She hadn't decided which one she was going to do yet. She left that night not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know how to make him see what she saw when she looked at him. She drove the 3 hours back to the city in silence. No music, no phone calls, just the engine and the road and the ache of leaving something unfinished. And the worst part was knowing that the unfinished thing wasn't her fault alone. It was his, too. He'd decided he wasn't enough, and she couldn't make him undecide it. And that helplessness was a feeling she'd never experienced before, because where she came from, there was always a deal to be made. This time there wasn't. The days that followed were ordinary, which was the worst part, because ordinary used to be enough. Jack went back to his routine. Oil changes and brake pads, and the slow restoration of the Ford truck that he'd been working on for 2 years now, and the garage smelled the same, the radio played the same songs, and the coffee was just as bad as it had always been. But the stool where she'd sat was empty. in a way it hadn't been before, and the thermos she'd held seemed to remember the shape of her hands. And the porch chairs sat side by side in the evenings, like they were waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. He called her number once, late past 11. The house dark and the phone heavy in his hand, and he dialed and let it ring once, and then he hung up before she could answer. He didn't know what to say, and he was afraid that silence on the other end would confirm what he already believed, that he wasn't the kind of man a woman like her called back. The phone went back on the hook, and the napkin stayed on the windowsill, and he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, and the lavender soap smell drifted in from the bathroom, and he thought about how his mother would have told him to try, and how not trying was easier, and how easier wasn't the same as right. 300 miles away! Layla stared at her phone at the missed call from an unknown number, and something in her chest tightened. She knew, she just knew, and the knowing was worse than not knowing, because it meant he'd reached out and then changed his mind, and that was a different kind of distance than never reaching at all. It meant the door was there, and he'd walked up to it, and then he'd turned around. She went to the dinner at the estate the next weekend, the one her father had arranged, and Richard was there in a tailored suit, and he was perfectly courteous and perfectly ambitious, and he talked about their future the way you'd talk about a quarterly projection, with confidence and specificity and no warmth at all. She sat across from him in a candlelit dining room that could have been in a magazine, and she listened to him describe the life they would build together, and every word was correct, and every word was hollow. She thought about a man who fixed her car and refused to take her money, and a porch with 2 rocking chairs under a sky she could actually see, and a laugh that broke out of her, like it had been waiting years for permission, and the distance between that life and this one wasn't miles, it was the distance between being wanted and being chosen. And somewhere in the space between Richard's confident predictions and the silence of her own heart, she made a decision she hadn't planned to make. 2 days after the dinner, Layla packed a single bag, not the kind of luggage she'd normally take on a trip. Just a canvas bag with a change of clothes, and a book, and the napkin she'd written her number on, which she'd saved from the porch railing the first time she visited, folded in her jacket pocket. She called her father and said she needed time, and his silence on the other end was louder than any objection he could have made, because they both knew what time meant in their family, and it wasn't approval, but it was a kind of permission she'd never asked for before. She didn't call ahead or make a plan, just got in the car and drove, and the city shrank in the rearview mirror, and the fields opened up, and the road became the road she remembered, the one with the plywood sign, and the blinking yellow light, and the smell of cut grass and diesel. 3 hours later, the garage appeared on the left, bay door open, radio playing, and Jack was under the hood of an old sedan, and he heard heels on concrete, and he knew before he even looked up. And this time when he rolled out from under the car and saw her standing there, the feeling he'd been holding back for weeks came up so fast it nearly knocked the breath out of him. She was standing there in jeans and a simple white blouse, her hair down, no jacket, no armor, just a woman who'd driven 300 miles because she couldn't breathe in the life she'd been given. She didn't say anything grand or make a speech or try to explain in big words what she was feeling, because the small words were truer and closer to what she actually meant. She just looked at him and said, "I didn't come back for the car." Jack stood there with grease on his hands and a rag hanging from his back pocket, and every reason he shouldn't do this ran through his head in the space of a single breath. She was from a world he didn't know, a world of ballrooms and country clubs and people who spoke in calculations, and her father would never accept a mechanic from a town with 1 traffic light, and he had nothing to offer her except a small house and a steady hand and the promise of showing up every day and meaning it. The list of reasons was long and logical and airtight, and every one of them was true, and none of them mattered when he looked at her face. Because what he saw was the same thing he'd seen on the porch that night. A woman who just wanted to be known, not owned, not displayed, not used as a door for someone else to walk through. A woman who had everything the world said she should want and still came back to a garage in a town no one had heard of, because the one thing she actually needed couldn't be bought or arranged or inherited. He took a breath and he told her the truth the way he always did, even when the truth was hard. "I don't have what you're used to. I can't give you galas or private planes or a name that opens doors." And she told him the truth back, standing in the open bay door with the afternoon light behind her, and her voice was steady and quiet, and more certain than anything he'd ever heard her say. "I've had all of that. It's not the same as being seen. The words hung in the air between them, and they were the truest thing either of them had ever said. And after that, there was nothing left to argue about. He took a step toward her, and then another, and somewhere between the oil-stained concrete floor and the woman who drove 300 miles to find him, he stopped being afraid. Not because the reasons disappeared, but because the reasons were smaller than the thing he'd be giving up if he let them win. She didn't need him to be rich. She needed him to be exactly who he was, the man who fixed things and didn't charge extra, looked at her like she was a person instead of a prize. He reached for her hand and she took it, and the feeling was so simple and so steady that it didn't need a single adjective to describe it. The garage was quiet, and the radio was playing something slow, and two people from completely different worlds stood there holding hands in the place where they'd first met, and the only world that mattered was the one they were standing in. It wasn't a grand gesture or a declaration, just two people choosing each other, which is the bravest thing anyone can do, and the quietest, and the most real. And the thing about choosing someone is that it doesn't erase the differences or make the hard parts disappear. What it does is something simpler and stranger. It makes the differences matter less, because the person standing next to you matters more. The porch light was on when they got home, just like it always was, and the two rocking chairs were waiting in the dark like they'd never been empty at all. Some stories end with a door closing, but this one ends with two people walking through one together, and that makes all the difference. If this story spoke to you, subscribe and let us know which moment stayed with you the longest.